Hello and welcome to the second session in this mini Bible study series on After Easter Encounters with Jesus. Last week we looked at the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and this week we're going to look at Jesus and his encounter with a prominent disciple, Peter. And the reading for this week is John 21 and the first 19 verses. And so I trust that you've familiarized yourself with that already. And the title for today's talk is A Famous Failure, Jesus and a Boat. In the previous chapter, in chapter 20, Jesus appeared the first day that he had rose from the dead, Easter Sunday. He appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden, and he commissions her. She was the first eyewitness of the resurrection. So he commissions her to go and tell the disciples and Peter that he will meet them in Galilee. Tell them to go to Galilee and he would meet them there. And so in the next chapter, chapter 21, John picks up that account. And clearly it wasn't just a message that Peter needed. He needed a one-to-one with Jesus. So since the death and the resurrection of Jesus, it had been somewhat of a roller coaster ride for the disciples. There was a lot to take in. There was a lot to get their heads around. They knew that Jesus had a mandate for them. He had a mission ahead of them to share the gospel, of course, with the known world. But they didn't really know where to start or how to go about it. And it seems as if they needed some getaway time for a while. And Peter was quite influential in trying to arrange something that would take them away from Jerusalem, take them away from where it was all happening. And they would just get away for a while. And so Peter with several other disciples, they make the 80-mile trek from Jerusalem down to the Sea of Galilee. And Peter, he's still hurting from what happened on the eve of Good Friday, and he's struggling to come to terms with the gravity of what he had done in denying Jesus. And so he feels the need to get back to the familiar. And the familiar for him was the fishing industry. So he thought, well, that's what I'm good at. I'm not very good at a disciple. I'm pretty convinced that I've disqualified myself from any future leadership. So I think it's time to just pull away, time to withdraw, go back to the boats, go back to what I know I can do well. And of course, the irony is that it was the boats that the boats were the very thing that he left to follow Jesus, but he now goes back to that same trade. And I guess there are times in our lives when we feel that we have let Jesus down, and as a result, we have to cope with the guilt, the real sense of regret and guilt, and human nature being what it is, we often retreat to something that we're familiar with. We retreat maybe to something of ease and that's going to be a comfort to us. And we throw ourselves into it in an attempt to try and deal with the guilt that is surrounding us and the wrongdoing perhaps. And Peter goes back to his boat. And so where do you go? Wherever you choose to go and hide or retreat, and God knows where you are. You can't run away from God. However much you feel guilty, however much you feel that you've let him down, and living with the regret, God knows where you are. So if you've drifted away, God knows exactly where you are. And Jesus knew where to find Peter. His relationship with Peter began on the sea. You'll remember in Matthew chapter 4 in the Gospels. And so Jesus knew where to find Peter. And the Word of God tells us in the text that we've selected for today that Peter is joined on this fishing trip by several other disciples, and they are named in the beginning of the chapter. But it didn't go that well. It was a bit of a fruitless expedition. They laboured all night and caught nothing. That was a very unusual experience, of course, for them, because professional fishermen are expected to bring home some fish. Sounds a lot like the incident that we read of in the Gospels in Luke chapter 5, where, again, you might be familiar with it, that the disciples had fished all night and caught nothing. They were despondent. Early next morning, they are washing out their nets. All they wanted to do was to go home and go to bed and write it off. It had been a bad shift, and let's just write it off and start again tomorrow. And Jesus shows up on the shore, and the first thing he says to them is, let's go fishing. That's the last thing they wanted to do. Dubious, because, they'd been out all night. Here's a carpenter telling fishermen to go back fishing. And so, anyway, you know the story, how Peter, after a while, he comes to terms with it and he responds to the instruction of Jesus. And you know the rest. They had a bumper catch, so much so that they have to call for another boat to come alongside them and help them. They had to send for reinforcements simply because they responded to the word from Jesus. So back to John 21, it's a new day, it's the dawn is beginning to break, and they haven't caught anything. The boat is empty. The boat is symbolic of their hearts. It's empty. There's nothing there. And through the early morning mist, there's a figure on the shore. There's a figure that they don't know who it is at first. And he simply says, friends, haven't you any fish? Jesus would have been saying, hey lads, have you got any fish on board? Have you caught anything? I suggest it's probably a bit of a tongue-in-cheek statement from Jesus. Of course he knew that the boat was empty, that they had no fish. But in other words, Jesus was saying to them, you've chose to go back fishing. You've chose to go back to a life of comfort, which gives you self-esteem. And has it worked? Have you caught any fish? And of course, it was a no from the disciples. And in the text, it just simply says no. But I would like to have known, I'd love to know the tone of voice that they used in responding to Jesus. Was it one of them said no? Was it a collective no? Was it a no of irritation, of embarrassment? Did they shout it? Did they whisper it? Was it a booming no? But they simply said no. And of course, the timing of Jesus is impeccable here, because this stranger on the shore, having asked them if they got any fish, then gives them further instructions. And the instruction is to fish on the opposite side that they had been fishing on. So here again, you have a carpenter telling some seasoned fishermen where to fish. But of course, we know that he's more than a carpenter. This was Jesus, the Lord of creation. He knows where the fish are. And one word from him will bring those fish to the net. He's the Lord over all creation. Jesus knows that there's fish just waiting for his instruction to swim to that net. So despite a fruitless night and failure out on the sea, and now their failure to recognize Jesus, they simply follow the instructions of this stranger, and their fortunes are reversed. They might have thought, well, what have we got to lose? We've caught nothing. We're still out from shore. We're a good way out from shore. He's telling us to put the net down on the right side. It's a long shot, but hey, let's give it a go. And of course, the disciples found that the instruction worked, and they had a bumper catch. Despite all their efforts, they caught nothing. But now Jesus instructs them, and they follow his command, and they catch an enormous amount of fish in their net. And there are times in our ministry, in our church, in our Christian lives, that God allows us to go through some barren spells. He allows us to go sometimes where we feel it's fruitless. We're not producing anything. And of course, he's teaching us that it's not about us. And we're not to trust in ourselves, but we are to trust in him. And there are times that we've all worked hard and lots of effort and endeavour, and yet we've come up empty. We've no fruit to show for our labours. Despite our best plans, we've nothing to show for it. And then sometimes we get a word from the Holy Spirit that ignites us, that just energises us to go again. And that word can change everything. Because as I said, without him, we can do nothing. So this figure on the shore was an entire stranger to them. However, the disciples followed his instruction as asked, and they were successful beyond expectation. There was an abundance of fish. They were flush with fish, all because of the tip-off from a character, an outsider that was a stranger to them. And so with a net full of fish at breaking point, they began to pull in the catch. You see, the failure to catch fish would have been demoralizing for them. They had expended lots of energy, lots of effort, and yet gained nothing in return. And yet Jesus, with a simple word of instruction, suddenly the thing changes and they have this bumper catch. And through that early morning mist, it's John who connects the dots and realizes, hey, this is Jesus. It's the Lord. He turns to Peter and says, it's the Lord. Clearly, this was a supernatural power at work. And so the identity of the man on the shore is obvious. It's Jesus. John recognizes him, but it's Peter who responds to him. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that Peter is the first to act. He wraps a garment around him and he plunges into the sea. It's typical impulsive Peter. He leaves behind one of the greatest catches he's ever had because his whole demeanour wants to be with Jesus. His quick reaction reveals his true feelings towards Jesus. He was so eager to be in the presence of Jesus, and he couldn't wait to get out of the boat to come and see his Lord and Saviour. Peter's actions may seem strange to us, because why would Peter put on an outer garment before swimming? Normally people take off unnecessary clothing before swimming. But of course Peter, it seems, he felt he was dressed inappropriately. And so he's down to his loincloth. And so he needs to put on his outer garment. Such was his respect for his Lord. You know, there's another famous incident involving Peter, Jesus, and a boat in Matthew chapter 14. The circumstances are very different there. Of course, Jesus is walking on the water and he invites Peter to step out of the boat and join him. And of course, there's great hesitation with Peter then. He's waiting for confirmation that it is the Lord. He's quite cautious and hesitant, and he slowly climbs over the one side of the boat and tentatively takes the first step. But here he's out of the boat in an instant. When John says to him, it's the Lord, he's immediately out of the boat. He's into the water. He's about 100 yards from the shore. He can't wait to get to Jesus. And you know, most of us are like Peter, I think. Most of us are like the Peter in Matthew chapter 14, perhaps. We're hesitant. We're cautious. We want confirmation. And Jesus speaks to us to join him, to walk on the water, and to take risks and to do stuff that we've not done before. And if we're truthful, we're like the Peter in Matthew 14 rather than the Peter in John 21. There on the beach, Jesus has prepared breakfast. John refers to the fact that there's a charcoal fire burning. Only twice a charcoal fire is mentioned in the scripture, and on both occasions, Peter is present. You remember when Peter denied the Lord, just on the eve of Good Friday, he's in the courtyard of the high priest, and it says he warmed himself by a charcoal fire. And now this second reference is Peter's restoration. So he was at a fire when he denied Jesus, and he's at a fire where he restores, when Jesus wonderfully restores him. And these two events, of course, are only just days apart. I wonder what he thought when he got on the shore. He saw the fire, he smelt the fire. It would have triggered his memory. It would have served as a reminder to Peter what he had done. Jesus wasn't looking to up the ante for him in any way. Jesus wasn't looking to bring him into further torment. Jesus was there to bring healing and forgiveness. Jesus restages something that he might restore him and re-energize him. Jesus acts as the host and says, "Come and eat breakfast." You know, one would have expected Jesus to have gone nuclear on Peter. He would have pointed the finger, the accusing finger at him. He would have called down so many "I told you so," "I warned you about what you were going to do, you did not listen to me," etc. We don't read any of that. Jesus' heart is towards him, a heart of love, a heart of forgiveness. Jesus has breakfast ready. He's everything in place. There's fish and there's bread. And if you're like me, you've asked yourself, where did those fish come from? Because the disciples had caught the fish, but the fish was still in the net, in the boat at this stage. But Jesus already had fish on the barbecue. You wonder where they came from. But of course, he's the Lord of creation. And no doubt those fish became available to him at his word of instruction. And so he invites, when he sees that they've got fish, he invites them to bring their catch as well. Bring something of what you've caught. How gracious is God that he invites us into partnership with him. We are co-workers with him, co-laborers. The talents that we have, the giftings that we have, he invites us to come, to bring them and to share in what he is doing as well. Simon Peter. Notice always when John refers to him, or John in his Gospels always refers to him as Simon Peter. And that's a before and after picture, of course. Simon was his old name, and when Jesus met him, he says, "I'm going to change your name to Peter." Simon means a reed, somebody that's easily blown around, that's quite fragile. And but Peter means a rock, of course, that you're going to be a rock-like figure. You're going to be a true leader. And but he calls him Simon Peter. And he then drags the full net of fish. It seems himself. He goes back. When Jesus said, "Bring your fish," he goes back to the boat and gets the net. And John tells us that it was full of large fish. Don't miss that. Of large fish. It was at breaking point. Actually, we're told how many fish as well. It's 153. Now, there's lots of speculation about that. And lots of Bible commentators believe that it was 153 different kinds of fish, different species of fish. I mean, that's interesting. And of course, they make out from that the gospel is for everybody. Whatever culture or creed or nationality, the culture is for the gospel is for everyone. That might be the case. I'll just leave that with you. But Jesus has prepared breakfast, and he's calling the disciples to come and join him for breakfast. And you can't help but be impressed at the servant nature of Jesus. You know, just days before this, the disciples had been at another meal with Jesus. Jesus had hosted supper with them. And that was the time, of course, in the lead up to the cross, the Last Supper. And it's on that occasion where Jesus looks over the table at Peter and says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. but I have prayed for you, that your faith fail not. He's given him a warning there. He's telling him that a trap has been set, and he's warning him. That was supper, and he went out and failed Jesus. This is breakfast. It's a new day. It's a new beginning. Jesus wants to draw Peter away from his past. He might have been trapped by his past. Jesus wants to set him free from all that and launch him into a whole new future. You know, Peter is loved by us all. Why? Because he's like us. He has all the weaknesses and the failures that we are so familiar with. He overestimates himself on times. He underestimates temptation, thinking that he's above it. He thinks he loved Jesus more than anyone else. He doesn't think anybody can serve Jesus like he does. That's in many of us, I guess, as well. You see, remember at the Last Supper, he had boasted that he had a very high view of Jesus. His loyalty for Jesus was beyond question, that he would be more reliable. You could count on him more than the other disciples. And yet he is the one that failed miserably. And Jesus was about to indirectly remind him of that. So Jesus, after breakfast is finished, after they've had some banter and some conversation, Jesus then engages in a one-to-one conversation with Peter. Why? Because there's unfinished business to attend to. Jesus wasn't going to sweep this under the carpet. There's unfinished business. And 3 times, of course, he asks Peter the question, Peter, do you love me? Because 3 times he had denied the Lord. So 3 times Jesus is looking for that question to be answered. Peter would have been hurting inside. He would have been so upset. He's hurt that Jesus is even raising it again, the 3 denials. Can't we move on? Can't we just not pretend it never happened? Can't we just, forget it and I'm sorry and let's... But Jesus was insistent that we had this conversation, and he probes into Peter's heart. Do you love me, Peter? And he adds the little phrase, more than these. Some people have said more than the boats, more than the fish. I seem to think it's more than the disciples. You said you love me more than these, Peter. Do you really love me more than these things? Do you love me more than your former life? You've gone back to it. Do you love me more than the things you did in the past? You see, do you love me more than just being a prominent fisherman and being known by everybody as the captain of the ship? Jesus brings healing to that guilty heart. And the word for love, of course, that Jesus uses in the Greek is a word called agape. And it's a precious word because it means God's love. It means the highest level of love. It's the love that's described in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul writes an absolute masterpiece on love. And he says, do you love me? Do you love me with agape love? Peter responds with a more modest kind of love. He drops down a notch or two, and he uses a Greek word called phileo, which means brotherly affection. So Jesus said, do you love me with the love of God? That pure love, that highest love you can find. And Peter responds with brotherly affection. And of course, by the time Jesus comes to ask him the 3rd time, do you love me? Peter's already answered yes twice, and you wonder what else he can say. And he just leans into the fact that, Jesus, you know everything. Peter was still unsure of himself. He knew what he had done. He had failed. And he leans into the fact that Jesus has all knowledge. Jesus knows his heart. He knows his motives. He knows everything about him. Peter is not the rock he thinks he is. Peter is not as faithful as he thinks he is. Peter is not as loyal as he thinks he is. He says, Lord, you know me, all my failings and weaknesses. If you still want me to be your friend, Jesus, I want to be your friend. If you still want me on your team, Jesus, I'm happy to serve you. But Jesus, I'm not sure if I can love you with the kind of love that you want me to have, but you know my heart. And Peter is wonderfully reinstated. There on the beach, Jesus gave Peter the greatest invitation any of us can receive on earth, where Jesus says, follow me. And each affirmation of love, when Peter said, yes, Lord, I love you, is followed by a commission. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. Jesus moves from fishing to shepherding. He moves from the fish to the sheep. And of course, those two things are very important in the life of any church, fishing and shepherding. Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. In other words, Jesus is saying to him, Peter, you're still on the team. You've got an amazing future in front of you. I'm restoring you to a pastoral position with a fresh commission. And when you read the book of Acts, you'll see exactly that. This new Peter, standing up with boldness, preaching on the day of Pentecost, doing signs and wonders, doing amazing things. He's fully restored and refocused and renewed and functional in the church again. A wonderful after Easter encounter with Jesus. Let me just finish with a little story that I read in a book by Max Lucado, who says that many years ago when he was a child, he was in a supermarket with his mother and his friend, and him and his friend were just 4, 5, 6 years of age, whatever, and they were running up and down the aisles. They broke free from his mother, and they're running up and down the aisles, and Max Lucado runs into a display stand of honey, jars of honey, and he says, he knocks them all over, and some of them smash, of course, and he sits on the floor, and there's all this sticky honey around him, and the manager of the shop runs over and says, whose son are you? Where's your mother? And all of a sudden, in the next aisle, his mother could be heard saying, he belongs to me and I'll clean it up. And when I read that story, I thought, that's a great line for what Jesus did with Peter. He belongs to me and I'll clean up the mess. Jesus intentionally restored Peter in the presence of the disciples. We belong to him. And he's cleaned up your mess. And he wants to launch you into a whole new future of ministry and blessing and service. May the Lord bless you. Thank you for joining us for this Bible study. I trust you'll have a great time in your discussion groups. Bless you.